and the horse country around here. He's not ever been up here, so um, got a few things to show him in the neighborhood. It it reminds me of Ocala, the way Ocala used to be in Florida. It doesn't look as much like that now, but just beautiful horse country.
I've been there many times, and that is one of my favorite places. And they have some of the coolest restaurants and the neatest shops, and it just Of course, it's been a lot of years since I've been there, so I assume it still has.
Well, I will definitely give you a report. And on Monday, so next week, I don't have any idea. All of the shows will probably be first thing in the morning because I am going to be visiting with, I have to tell y'all this story. Forgive me. Then we'll get to the book. When y'all know that I was stationed in Italy. When I came back from Italy to the United States, I had deployed. You guys know I've told you that I was in northern Iraq and I wore a whole bunch of different hats there. But in the career field that I was in as a company grade officer, which was as a personnel officer, I've shared with you that you basically, your wartime mission is like mortuary affairs and accountability of people when you forward deploy. They were called PERSCO teams, and it's personnel accountability. So when for Operation Provide Comfort, Incirlik, Turkey, Incirlik Air Base in Turkey was the headquarters of Operation Provide Comfort. General Shalikashvili, who goes on to be the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was the commander of Provide Comfort when he was a 3-star. And we personnelists are responsible as people deploy into Incirlik to upload their personnel data for accountability. So if a bomb goes off or whatever, you can do all the casualty reporting and that type of thing. So you know where everybody is all the time. And the Air Force at the time had one of the only systems that allowed you to account for other services. And so PERSCO, Air Force PERSCO teams were deployed at a lot of the forward operating locations. So when they set up Task Force Alpha and Bravo inside northern Iraq, as we went into northern Iraq to resettle the Kurds that had all left after Desert Storm kicked off, that was the primary mission, is to get the Kurds back into their cities, because the forces that were in northern Iraq had booby trapped all of the houses and the buildings, and there were bombs going off and blah, blah, blah. So we had a large EOD presence there to be able to get the Kurds' homes cleared so they could come back home. And of course, it was a humanitarian mission. We set up tent cities and all of this other stuff so we could migrate them in stages back into northern Iraq. And so I got a lot of experience hands-on in the field of doing personnel accountability. And there was not a lot of people in Air Force personnel that had actually been forward deployed and done that type of thing. So when I came back to the States, I was tapped to be a PERSCO evaluator of training that was being done in the Air Force. And so I got to go to lots of conferences and meet lots of people. My first base of assignment when I got back into the DC area was Andrews Air Force Base. And I was there for 2 years, and then I moved over to the Pentagon. And you guys have heard me tell stories about being at the Pentagon. Well, at Andrews, there was a whole bunch of different things going on. Y'all know that Andrews is host to Air Force One, and it's managed, it's under the command of Air Mobility Command, but Andrews had always been exempt from any type of inspections that are done on a rotating basis for readiness because of its mission. It has the first helicopter squadron there that does VIP stuff, and it has all of the VIP aircraft for the VP, for the SecDef, and all of that stuff. And so Air Mobility Command never inspected. They just expected them to be good because you had to be elite in order to be assigned to the air wing there. So they decide, Air Mobility Command, right after I got there, I mean, like literally right after I got there, decides that Andrews is going to be incorporated into the Air Force inspection program. And it's called an operational readiness inspection, an ORI. And just before I got there, there's a preliminary one that is done to see if you're ready. So that it's kind of like a pre-inspection. Well, it's called an ORE, an evaluation, getting ready for your ORI. Well, they failed it. And they failed it in some very significant ways. And personnel accountability was one of them. And so I show up, and also going on at the in the Air Force at the same time was a program that was called Bank Pilots. So we had an overabundance of pilots coming out of UPT. So they put them on an assignment in a support career field until they could get them an aircraft. So that was called Bank Pilots. And so there was a whole bunch of lieutenants running around the base. I just pinned on captain before I came back to the States. And they had no clue about personnel, let alone personnel readiness, which is why they flunked the inspection, the evaluation. So I get there, and there's a reserve wing that's on the backside of the base. And they have C-141s at the time. So they simultaneously do, if you host a reserve wing, they're incorporated into your evaluation and your inspection. So they come up with a scenario that says, hey, we're going to have this happen, and then you guys respond to it. And you generally don't know all of the aspects of it until a few days before, because it's a 72-hour response time. So they give you the scenario, you have a whole bunch of meetings, you activate all of the things. It's like what you would do in real world. The Air Force is supposed to be able to deploy anywhere in the world within 72 hours. And so the scenario going into the ORI, and I'd been there for a few months, attended all of the meetings, got things as best as I could set up so that we would be able to do well in the ORI. I met a woman, she was a major at the time, that was the full-time. So reserve wing has part-timers and full-timers. And the full-time major that ran the flying squadron for the reserve wing was a lady by the name of Mary Ann Miller. And she was amazing. One of the most put together, intelligent, wise people that I had ever met in my entire career. And that's true today. And and the wing commander over there was amazing too. His name was Clayton Gadd. So in these planning meetings, I was more outspoken than most captains would be, just because I felt like I didn't feel like it. I had more experience than most of the people. And so I looked at all of the write-ups on the areas that they were not very good at, and I fixed a lot of the stuff. And so it comes up to the actual ORI. And our scenario was that our mission was to go to Fort Bragg, pick up the 82nd Airborne, and we were going to deliver them to Fort Dix in New Jersey and Avon Park in Florida. And there was a whole bunch of discombobulation involved in it. But the end of the story is that we got an excellent on the ORI, which is like second best that you can get. And from a failure to that was like a miracle. And so I stayed in touch with Major Miller. And when I got my assignment over to the Pentagon, she was reassigned as a full time reservist to run the airlift part of the Air Force Reserve Command office at the Pentagon. And for those of you who don't know, that's a critical position in the Pentagon because on any given day, Air Mobility Command, 50% of their missions, and it's higher now, is flown by reserve crews. So, airline pilots that are reservists, during their time that they're not flying for their airline, they fly active duty missions. And there's a whole process of how that works. But the 141s at the time was kind of the workhorse of Air Mobility Command. So there were missions flying out of there all the time. In addition to that, at Andrews, they had one specific bird that set alert all the time on a 6-hour response time for the FBI. That was their response team that flew anywhere in the world if a crisis happened, like the bombing of Kobar Towers, the Cole attack, all of that stuff. That was a mission. Their emergency response team was flown by the reserve crew from the 459th Airlift Command. So very active, and I continued to work with them while I was at Andrews. And so her and I spent a lot of time together at the Air Staff, and we kind of worked back and forth. I had an assignment. My last assignment was working I had an assignment in the Pentagon for the Air Force Reserve Command too, because they have active duty people that work for them. My last assignment was with them as well. So again, her and I have stayed in contact this entire time. So the Air Force had decided that they were going to integrate a lot of the reserve general officers into their active duty positions. Mary Ann was one of those people that were tapped for that. So she ends up being, later on in her career, she gets promoted to her 3rd star as the chief of the Air Force Reserve Command. And she had a couple of other joint assignments in there on the joint staff and some other assignments. And then it's announced that she is going to be the first reserve officer ever to be the Air Mobility Command commander and pinned on her 4th star. So I went to her 3-star promotion ceremony, and this is the funny part of the story. We also got an invite, my husband and I, to her 4-star ceremony at Scott Air Force Base when she pinned on her 4th star. And I brought my middle daughter, who at the time was considering going into the Coast Guard and being a pilot, because a lot of female pilots were going to be there at Air Mobility Command, and I wanted my daughter to meet them. She later decided she didn't want to go in the military, which is fine. But when we get there, well, about a week before we were flying up there, I get a phone call from her sister. And she says, I have a huge favor. Marianne tells me that you do staging and real estate and stuff like that. And I said, I do. And she says, well, they're going to deliver her furniture the day before, and she has to host her house party the night of her promotion ceremony, and there's no way we can get the house ready. Will you help us? So we change our flight and we get in there 2 days early. And my husband, my daughter, and I all spent those like 18 hours in her house staging the entire house. Now, of course, I've been in her house. I know all the furniture she's had over the course of the last 15 years that I've known her. And we get the entire house set up. However, in this house, because it's base housing and it is the house, other than there's also a US Transcom 4-star there. So there's 2 4-stars. He has the Unified Command house is like the house. She has the second house on the parade field that's like these mansion houses that line this parade field. They're just big brick mansion looking like houses. And I walk into the foyer and there's this gaudy, nasty gold chandelier hanging in the foyer. And then I go in the first room off to the left is the dining room. And there's even a bigger, nasty, gaudy gold chandelier hanging in the dining room. And her furniture is kind of, I don't even know what you call it, her artwork. It's all kind of the Williamsburg kind of primary colors with a lot of black in it. And I looked at my husband and I said, that shit can't stay here. And of course, you guys know my husband's an electrical contractor. So I told Marianne's sister I need about $500. So she whips out $500. We go to Home Depot and I buy these beautiful black light fixtures. And I told her sister, I said, now, if anybody asks, you don't know who did this. And we change out these light fixtures and we got one for the living room that's consistent with the light. So that evening, after Marianne had been in briefings all day, she walks in and she's looking around. She's going, wow, I can't believe you guys did this. And I pulled her off to the side and I said, hey, if anybody asks you about the light fixtures, and she turned around and looked at it and she goes, oh my God, those are gorgeous. And I said, I know, but just pretend like you don't know who did that. And she just started laughing. So I tell you that whole story because when we leave here on Monday, she is now retired and she lives outside of Columbus, Ohio. And we are going to spend 4 days with her at her, we're going to be at a KOA, but right down the street from her. And I just got off the phone with her and I am tickled to death to be able to spend a few days with her and kind of catch up on all of the stuff that she's been doing since she retired. She volunteers. She's been doing all kinds of different uh, meetings of people that do business obviously in her line of work, and so I'm totally psyched out about that. And again, if she's in the top 3 people of professional military officers that I've ever worked with, and so I'm beyond ecstatic being able to catch up with her. So I just wanted to share that.
Awesome.
Yeah, I'm so excited. I didn't want to say anything until I confirmed, because she does get last minute calls to go off and be a consultant, and as all 4 stars do. And so until I confirmed with her a little closer to the time, I didn't want to share that story. But now that I know I'm safe, and I will let you guys know if I get any more pearls of wisdom from her. But again, okay, back to the story. We are on chapter 3 of Cocaine Death Squads and the War on Terror. Back to the real world. This particular chapter is labeled the narco state and the narco economy. And it kind of goes into depth of what happens to these countries that the CIA designates that are going to be kind of their narco state that they're going to use to traffic narcotics with. So, the cocaine decade of the 80s in Latin America is also commonly referred to as the lost decade. It was significant for the political and economic state of Colombia because it basically transitioned into a narco state. Their primary trade became cocaine, and Colombia took extraordinary measures to create an army and a paramilitary army to be able to sustain this narco state. And they did it with the aid of the CIA, the US State Department, and Southcom Command, which is headquartered down in Miami. And it became the decade when there was a declaration of basically all out civil war against the FARC in Colombia. So the measures included cocoa cultivation, production, marketing, transportation, and distribution networks for the new profit center of narcotics. In the new narco state, major drug traffickers and paramilitary militias of the AUC were integrated in every facet of the Colombian government, its legal system, its political system, and its financial system. The narco elite that enabled this emerged with the assistance of drug traffickers from the lowest social levels, such as Pablo Escobar, and the state created modes of production and distribution to form the new narco economy. Money laundering was the financial basis of the connection between Colombia and the United States. The U.S. Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, defines money laundering as the process by which criminals or criminal organizations seek to disguise the illicit nature of their proceeds by introducing them into legitimate commerce and finance. Like buying banks, buying real estate, that type of thing. It is a process associated with globalization, market integration, and technology innovation that reshapes both the country where it originates from, but also the host country, and in this case, it's the United States. Investigative journalists have drawn attention to the global rise of organized crime and these organizations. The links between Colombia's economy and the cocaine trade indicate that the political economy of cocaine extends further and deeper than just simple money laundering. Although Colombia became a major supplier of the global drug trade during the cocaine decade, a number of myths aimed at downplaying this or explaining it away in a self serving manner arose, both in Colombia and the United States. They argued that number one, cocaine is not important to Colombia's economy. Number two, the importance of cocaine to Colombia was exaggerated. Number three, the killing and imprisonment of cartel leaders made a difference. Number four, the cocaine trade exists because of corruption and criminal organizations that outsmart authorities and the law. Not that they were part of it, but they were just smarter than them. Number five, the CIA was never, ever involved in trafficking drugs. Number six, drugs are not important to the U.S. economy. To unravel the myths, it is necessary to make a class analysis of both Colombian society and the relationship between Colombia and the U.S. The formation of Colombian drug cartels helped to coordinate cocoa production, but it also intensified existing class antagonisms within the country because you have to have a strategy of tension in order for this to work. Colombia was the only country in the cocoa growing zone that succeeded in developing sophisticated drug cartels and international marketing networks. The new class, the narco elite, exploited the economic opportunities in cocaine production. In Colombians' history, state institutions have always been protected by political and economic interest of the Colombian ruling class. And remember, that's kind of one of the patterns that we see, that you have to have a corrupt ruling class in order for this to work. The cocaine trade in Colombia created a narco elite whose development from the Colombian compador class, the lower class, was linked to the cartel operations. Paramilitary militia were set up by the lower class to target their traditional enemies that were the peasants fighting back against them, which the FARC represented, but also any other obstacle to economic operations and foreign investment that enabled the cocaine trade. Those who opposed the militia, like trade unions, human rights workers, investigative journalists, teachers, or academics that wrote about what was actually going on, immediately were declared enemies of the state, not enemies of the drug cartel, not enemies of the paramilitary, but enemies of the state, because the state embraced all of that. The continuing class conflict between the lower class and those backed by the United States imperialism was inevitable. Among this arrangement were short term agreements that were made on coca production that paved the road for longer term agreements of all kinds, one of which supported the emergence of a narco elite whose business operations had remained relatively independent. They agreed amongst themselves not to increase the amount of cocaine sold on American streets beyond certain limits, which was policed by the CIA, in order to not adversely impact their enterprise. The resulting drug cartels gave rise to coca production that was a monopolistic endeavor. The emerging narco capitalism permeated Colombia's financial system, creating financial connections throughout the Colombian economy. The active participation of banks in the cocaine industry greatly strengthened financial connections with the narco elite. The Cali cartel metamorphed into numerous legitimate business enterprises such as pharmaceutical companies and real estate firms that operated the cocaine trade. The Medellin cartel focused simply on money laundering because they were reinvesting their profits into their local communities. The cartel's monopoly presented opportunities to for enrichment of all Colombian capital, regardless of whether enterprises were directly or indirectly involved in it. This situation created competition among traffickers with connections to the ruling class. The Medellin cartel waged a desperate battle against enterprises that refused to enter into alliance with them. All manner of underhanded methods, from blackmail to murder, was employed. The violent liquidation of rival enterprises, many who collaborated with the CIA, provoked retaliation from the United States, which declared a war on drugs, but only Pablo Escobar's network. An Amnesty International report described Colombian state struggle for control of the uh, cocaine cartel. This is an actual quote from the report. The Prosecutor General's public ministry and civilian security agencies have initiated investigations into the composition of paramilitary groups and the source of their financial support. Through such investigations, evidence has emerged that many paramilitary death squads are financed by landowners, industrialists, and alleged drug traffickers, and operate in coordination with or under the authority of the Colombian Armed Forces. You know, the ones we're funding with military aid, those same guys. Armed forces units, which have persistently been implicated in paramilitary death squad activities, include the new intelligence unit of the National Police, the Army's Intelligence Division, and the Army's Intelligence and Counterintelligence Unit, BENSI. So that's the end of the quote. So basically, what this is saying is the same follow on to the Office of Public Safety was being used in Colombia to set up and train a national police force. Now, this is the 80s, and we know officially the OPS, Office of Public Safety, closed in 1974, but we've also proven that it didn't go away. So they set up the national police, they being the U.S. State Department, the CIA, and it is implicated in the activities of the death squads, which is exactly what we found in Chile, in Brazil, in Uruguay, all of them, that has this exact same setup for different reasons. The other countries weren't necessarily narco states, but they were states that U.S. oligarchs had investments in them. But it's the same model. As the Colombian state became embroiled in the cocaine trade, the problem for the narco elite soon became the prominence of the Medellin cartel, which acted independently of the national business elite. Of all the state institutions, the military is the best equipped to defend the state entrance. As military officers recruited from urban middle class and elite were conceivably open to politicalization by ideologues and thus posed a security risk, they were predominantly drawn from the peasantry. As in other Latin American countries, the role of the military in Colombia was crucial. According to the UN Drug Control Program, the biggest heroin and cocaine trafficking institutions in the world were the militaries of Burma, Pakistan, Mexico, Peru, and Colombia, all armed and trained by the U.S. military intelligence in the name of an anti drug effort. So we were training them, but we were training them basically enabling the narco state. The CIA justifies this quote unquote anti drug effort, kind of like the anti communist effort, by the way, through its operational guidance, which claims its interest in the drug trade is confined only to the effects the drug business has on geopolitical power. Okay. The war on drugs and the war on terror have forged strong connections between the military forces of the U.S. and Colombia. Since contributing to the creation of the paramilitary network, MAS, the Colombian military and the U.S. intelligence continued to work in tandem, fomenting alliances to fight the guerrillas as an integral part of their counterinsurgency doctrine. With the inauguration of President Julio Cesar Turbay Ayala in 1978 through 1982, the military and police assumed a prominent role as defenders of a Colombian state enmeshed in the cocaine trade. High-ranking military officers and paramilitary leaders began to buy land close to areas controlled by the FARC in an effort to drive them off their land and liquidate their support base, a counterinsurgency strategy that later developed into campaigns of extensive crop fumigation and military enforced relocation, not unlike we saw in Operation Phoenix or the Phoenix program in Vietnam. Active and reserve Army officers played a leading role in emerging narco state. One paramilitary group was formed in Segovia. It was called the Antigua Department by Fidel and Carlos Castano, the leaders of the AUC. The Castanos were from an upper middle class land owning family, the narco elite. Offered their services, particularly in the area of intelligence, to the military battalion Bombona that operated in Segovia. Another paramilitary group known as Fiente Calima in Valle del Canta Department was founded with the participation of active, retired, and reserve military officers attached to the military's 3rd Brigade, along with paramilitaries from the self-defense groups in 2 other locations, which operated mainly in that surrounding area. Colombia's paramilitary militias are not independent initiatives of the state, but rather a component of the Colombian overall intelligence network. U.S. military advisors, with British and Israeli assistance, helped reshape the military intelligence network. According to Human Rights Watch, in a report in 2000, half of the commanders of the Colombian army have been investigated because they were associated with the paramilitary groups. They were basically leading the paramilitary groups under the guise of them being in the military, but because they were death squads, they wanted to keep the appearance of them being separate. In that area, the Castano brothers played a central role in Colombia's national counterinsurgency strategy against the FARC. Carlos Castano's control of Uraba and other areas close to the border with Panama, a major transshipment route, placed him in a favorable position to shape and ultimately inherit a drug trafficking network with contacts in the interior of the country as well as international markets. While the military and police remained as the official army of the Colombian state, the paramilitaries became their clandestine army of the narco state. As late as 1998, further reconstructing of the Colombian state was occurring. Two widely publicized foiled drug trafficking attempts by Colombian Air Force officers, one that used the presidential plane of Colombia. It's the Colombian Air Force flying the presidential plane, revealed that the Air Force command system's involvement in drug trafficking. The officers were referred to as the Blue Cartel, an allusion to their blue uniforms. In another example, 1,600 pounds of cocaine were found in a Colombian Air Force plane that landed in Fort Lauderdale in 1998. In 2000, Colombia's Director of Intelligence in the Department of Administrative Security, which coordinates security function of the military and police, along with the head of the Colombia's counterintelligence unit and the coordinator for security operations, were implicated in trafficking arms and the embezzlement of public funds, as well as other charges. There is no difference between the government, the military, and the narco state in Colombia. The influence of cocaine trade is further reflected in the influx of newcomers to the political system in Colombia. The political career of Alvaro Uribe Velez, the guy whose son was just shot in June and died a few days ago, the country's former president and a leading, what's the better word? They use a Spanish word, but connection to Washington's war on drugs and terror began by granting pilot license to drug traffickers as head of aviation company Aero Civil, AEROCIVIL. With the support of his father, Alberto Uribe Sierra, he made his most important contacts with the emerging narco state as head of Aero Civil. Uribe Sierra became a household name when he was indicted for his involvement in the widely reported raid on a cocaine processing laboratory. According to Colombian investigative journalist Gomez, the police had tried to pin the laboratory on the FARC, when in fact the laboratory had enjoyed high-level production and protection from the Colombian military. CIA Director William Casey contended at the time that the laboratory was guarded by the FARC and planned by the Medellin cartel. But it was later revealed that the laboratory was being ran by the Cali cartel and protected by the Colombian army. The charge that the FARC protected the cocaine lab arose from the discovery of the planted bark uniform. Uribe Sierra, who owned extensive cattle ranches in that area and became a real estate intermediary for the traffickers, was connected by marriage to the family called Ochus, Ochoas. They were an elite family that joined the narco elite to help form the original Medellin cartel. When Pablo Escobar launched his version of the Medellin cartel in 1982, Uribe Sierra organized an exclusive horse race to raise funds. When he was killed in 1983, his son, Alvaro Uribe, flew to his ranch in Escobar's helicopter. Alvaro Uribe's wealth and connections to the underworld through his father practically assured him a place in the new narco state. During Alvaro Uribe's 4-month tenure as mayor of the local Medellin area in 1982, the city was known as the Sanctuary because it was untouchable. Medellin, under Escobar's control, linked the central and western highlands in the eastern lowlands and the Pacific and Atlantic coast through several cities. One of them was called Florencia, and another one was called Literia. They had built roads and airports for frontier settlers. That area, there was cocoa that was available, and it began providing known traffickers such as Escobar and the Ocas and the Castanos of access to the cocoa. When Alvaro Uribe's attendance at a Medellin cartel meeting at Escobar's ranch, Napoleus, another one of the drug traffickers, was made public. He was removed from his post as mayor. The political implications, however, was far from negative, as the fallout permitted him to become associated with the narco elite. So that's how you fail upwards in Colombia. Oh, you're into narcotics? Here, come do this over here. You don't want to bother with the being a mayor. He later on, let's see, the event would have destroyed most political careers, but between 95 and 97, Alvaro Uribe was the governor of one of the big areas, and in 2002, he goes on to become president of Colombia, a known drug trafficker. All right. While he was governor, he helped set up his own paramilitary force called the Convivars, later fell under the control of the AUC Constanos Cali cartel. His right-hand man was named Pedro Juan Moreno Villa. He was Colombia's leading importer of potassium permangranate, which was the leading chemical to manufacture cocaine. According to a DEA report released in 2000, this potassium whatever it is, importation was linked to Morano's company GMP products. In English, it translated to GMP chemical products. The most distinguishing feature of the Colombian narco economy is that all goods and services, both legal, for example, oil, coal, and coffee, and illegal, arms, human trafficking, contraband, drugs, are dependent on cocaine for the economic stability of the nation. Cocaine generated jobs not only directly in the production of cocaine, but indirectly, such as transportation, security, banking, communication, and most importantly, the paramilitary. It is because of Colombia's narco economy and its economic relationship with the U.S. that the Crystal Triangle supplies 100% of the cocaine and 60% of the heroin consumed on American streets. Drug trafficking and drug money deposited into U.S. and Colombian banks is common. It's virtually ignored by everyone. A major DEA report in 1999 cited heavy involvement in pervasive drug related corruption in all branches of the Colombian government, including its military, who, by the way, is still being trained today in the United States. As I told you earlier, when I visited at Fort Benning, the Hemispheric School outwalked a Colombian officer. And at the bottom of the steps were Colombian police. For example, Reuters reported that Colonel James Haidt, the head of the U.S. Army anti drug program in Colombia, was arrested. Let me say that again. U.S. Army officer Colonel James Haidt, Hiett, in charge of the quote unquote anti drug program in Colombia, was arrested along with his wife for smuggling cocaine into the United States in 2000. U.S. Army officer. The cocaine was found in a diplomatic pouch. Imagine that. The brother of General Luis Camacho Leva, the Colombian Army, was found with cocaine on a Ministry of Defense plane, and Fernando Botero, a former Colombian defense minister, was forced to resign for accepting drug money. In 1983, an elite Army squadron transported an entire cocaine processing lab from Colombia to Brazil using Colombian Air Force aircraft. When the elite anti-narcotic forces was established in 1989, it was created within the police force because military involvement in the drug trade was no secret. But the police force was set up by the CIA, so it's not going to be any better. The commander of the force, Colonel Hugo Martinez, and the head of the National Police Force, General Vargas, were accused but not convicted of accepting money from the Cali cartel. But they're not going to be convicted because the entire judicial system is infiltrated as well. In 1996, Colombian Air Force officers were caught smuggling heroin into the United States aboard the plane used by President Samper. However, such cases are increasingly sealed off from investigation and only documented during random inspection checks by the U.S. Customs or DEA personnel, indicating that substantially more drug shipments are carried out without detection. With a narco economy, other forms of transportation with private aircraft and speedboats would be assured entrance into the United States. Wow. Okay. So that's that chapter.
And just kind of like a giant shell game with these cartels.
Well, it's
who they're endorsing at the moment. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's important to detail how embedded the entire country's infrastructure is in this network by design. So you corrupt everyone, you corrupt all of the institutions, and we're seeing it played out in the United States. All of the corrupt politicians, all of the infiltration of all of the major centers of power in our country. It's the only way this thing perpetuates is if you control it all from the inside.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And and well, plant your own. Either they're planting CIA or their own assets within these groups and elevating them to leadership roles so that they can move them around to accomplish their end goal. Correct?
Well, whether it's actually, I mean, there's a whole smorgasbord of how it's done. So there are actual CIA agents that are Hispanic that are placed in these narco state organizations, but they also have their informants in all of them. And if anybody gets out of line, that's how they know who to whack. So it's a whole manner. It's an all of the above approach, whether it's actual CIA agents, whether it's CIA front companies operating as part of the logistical legs. Um, I would not be at all surprised if you find that a lot of the chemical middlemen were actually CIA, because that's how they're able to hide the bills of lading. Because if you go to do an inspection, they'll just say it's national security and classify it. So the entire apparatus is overseen by intelligence functions of multiple countries. As we've seen here, you've got Mossad, MI6, and the CIA involved, but it's under a protection umbrella, or it would not be allowed to sustain itself. Southern, go ahead.
Yeah, I actually remember the story about Laura Height. I just wanted to qualify something. She was actually a drug user herself, and she smuggled it, and then it got caught in the airport from a dog sniffing. Her husband was he knew about it, what she was doing, but he didn't do anything about it. So he ended up getting court-martialed. So it was really her doing it, but he was okay with taking the money from the sales. So that's how I heard the story. I was in Colombia. I've been there 3 times, and I was there about that same time, and they were talking about it because we met with the governors of Bogota and Bucaramanga, and we were escorted around in a protected vehicle with 2 police officers there. And they were loaded with gunpowder in their cars. It was pretty intimidating just getting in one. But another big thing that goes on in Colombia is they're worldwide known for their green emeralds. They are stunning and they are huge. But while I was there, they said, you should always know that every American dollar in the United States has been through drug money, has been used for drug money. That's how prolific it is in our country. That's terrifying, Colonel.
Yeah, well, so let me just make a couple of comments because I did look into the Army colonel. He was there as part of the military attache program as the Southcom lead in the quote unquote anti drug network. Now, the I don't even know where to start. You would have to be now again because he's going to understand as the anti-drug guy. He is going to be briefed extensively on the production of cocaine. He's not going to be like me when I first read this book and find out the entire logistical tell that it entails to make cocaine from a cocoa leaf. He's going to know all of this. And he's going to, because he's at the embassy co-located with the CIA, he's going to be fully aware. And what most people don't understand, and this is a pattern that I've established from way back when we started talking about Otto Skorzeny. The military attaches in these embassies act as handlers for assets in the country. I have seen this repeated over and over and over again. They are the perfect people to use for the CIA because of how we treat our military. They have the plausible deniability of ignorance while at the same time knowing everything that's going on. Now, if you go back to the Otto Skorzeny story and you realize that the two military liaisons that were his handlers in Spain, both of which were interviewed later, said that they were fully aware because they watch him. They know who's coming to visit him. That's what their whole job is. And so they were very much aware of what Otto Skorzeny was doing for NATO and the NATO people that came to visit him because their entire job was watching him. And so I could not give the colonel a pass on anything because of what I now know about what these people's jobs are in these embassies. So to
I
me,
know, and I agree. But the ironic part is she gets 5 years in federal prison. He gets court-martialed. When you get court-martialed, your term is so much more harsh. 5 months, Colonel. 5 months.
well,
So, yeah. But this was...
well, wait a minute, Southern. Southern, let me correct you here. If he was court-martialed, he for drug trafficking or whatever the charge was, he'd have lost
Misconduct.
I know, but it's misconduct, conduct unbecoming, all of that other stuff. He would have lost everything. He would have been reduced in rank as a colonel. It would be plausible to say he was over 20. He probably lost his retirement. The administrative what do I call it? The ability to exact punishment under court martial is much more devastating even than spending time in a jail cell, especially for a military officer and especially for a colonel, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and because I was over there about that time, and the reason it made so much news, it showed the vulnerability between the diplomatic channels and the U.S. on their anti-drug efforts under the Plan Colombia to combat narcotics, and then to have Colonel Knight.
It was a joke.
Other actors, yeah.
But it was a joke. And it's the same thing as using diplomatic pouches to send USAID torture devices into Uruguay for Dan Mederon to use on the citizens of Uruguay. In the Office of Public Safety in USAID, because many of these people were actually CIA agents themselves using this diplomatic pouch capability to smuggle things in and out, happened all the time. That's why I'm saying you almost now, based on our research, no matter what their actual job title is, if they are representing the United States government in a foreign country, there is a higher chance, almost 100%, 99.9%, they're actually CIA posing as some other name, whether it's USAID or Office of Public Safety, Office of Transition Initiative, because every single one of them things is infiltrated almost to the T, and 30 years later we find out, oh yeah, that guy was a CIA agent too.
I have a question. When you come through with a diplomat pouch and it was caught by a drug sniffing dog, is that common to do that with diplomat pouches? Don't they have immunity and whatever's in it?
So here's how that most likely happened. He's not going to, as I understand it, that the diplomatic pouch was found in the United States. So he would have had diplomatic immunity in Colombia. A U.S. Army officer has no immunity from trafficking drugs in the United States. So no U.S. citizen has diplomatic immunity inside the United States. If you have, and generally what would happen is coming through the airport, if they're just walking by a dog and they have a diplomatic pouch and the dog isn't necessarily searching that pouch, he alerts on it, they can't not take action on it. So the chances are that pouch was co-located with a drug dog and it alerted on it, and then you can't not, as a narcotics officer, not pursue the alert. That's a requirement by law. If they alert on something
inside the U.S.
inside the U.S. But even if he was in the embassy, and the diplomatic immunity only keeps you from being charged by the local government. So if he's in an embassy compound and that exact same thing happens, chances are everybody there is corrupt and he's not going to be held accountable anyway. But let's just say that you had an outlier that was on his own as an Army colonel, doing this as a lone wolf type thing. He still is on U.S. property in an embassy and would have still been held to account. The diplomatic immunity only keeps you from being charged by the local government in a foreign country. Does that make sense?
It does. And you're right. He lost everything. Couldn't get retirement. Couldn't get anything.
Yeah.
He lost everything.
Yeah.
Everything.
Yeah.
But I will never go back to Colombia. Our last time back there was during COVID, and we were helping them out with PPE and other things that they couldn't get. We stayed at a resort area, and coming back late from a meeting at one of the hospitals, we had like 20 people with guns leveled at us. And my police officer said, "Do not speak. Hand me your passport. Do not say a word, because you can, and you don't speak Spanish." And I went, "No." He said, "But just be quiet." So we got it and we got resolved. When we got to the airport to leave, there was nobody at the counter, and the person the next counter over for our flight said, "Go down this hallway and you see your airline door, just knock on it. You will hear like an intercom, explain your problem, and they'll send somebody out to you." Well, when they opened the door, Colonel, there were 2 officers there with shotguns for our heads. And I looked at my husband and said, "We are never coming back here again." I was just so stunned. He goes, "How are you so calm?" I said, "Because I've already dealt with this the night before. This is crazy."
Yeah.
This is crazy how they are so trigger happy to get right there with you. And they don't have a problem with it. It is their protocol. It is their protocol.
Well, they definitely don't have a problem killing you.
No, they don't. But there's too many witnesses out in the hallway. And my husband goes, "Why are you so calm?" I said, "Because I went through this last night," because he was not with me when it happened. And he said, "What?" I said,
"They don't care." But
they don't care.
Southern, they don't care if there's witnesses, because they act with impunity because they are part of the system. They don't care if there's witnesses.
Well, fortunately, we both had our passports out, because I said, "Just pull out your passport, because if they have a video, they can see the passport and they're going to see we're Americans."
Yeah.
And then when we leave to get on a flight, we had to go through a COVID test. I know the COVID test, and the COVID test they were using was the original COVID test, had nothing to do with the current last 2 or 3 variations of the COVID. So it was ridiculous. So we had COVID patients literally on the plane, because the test wouldn't have picked it up. But I was so happy to get back to the U.S. And I said, I will never go back.
Kiss the ground.
Yeah, I kissed that ground. Oh my God. I got in my car and I go, "I love America." But I do not want to go through that again. And my police officer gave me a huge tip. He came over and he goes, I don't recommend y'all coming back, and because it's going to get worse.
Yeah.
Because they were in a fight with who's going to win and all this, and it wasn't looking good. But the only positive thing I saw what the cartels did in Colombia, they did take care of their people. They got medical care and did a bunch of things for them. I guess to increase their to look out for them and protect them if somebody was coming through. But we saw talking to the governors and stuff. He said, "Yeah, that's what they do is good, but there's a price for that."
Well, the Medellin cartel did that. The Cali cartel did not. The Cali cartel was very, very brutal to the people, the peasant people, and they did not. The FARC did a lot of improvements in the area that they controlled. They built health facilities, they built schools, they did all kinds of things. The Medellin cartel with Pablo Escobar did as well. The Cali cartel absolutely did not.
Yeah, and the only reason I knew this is one of the meetings I was supposed to be in. They came to me and said, "We're going to have to cancel this meeting." And Giselle was with me, and I kind of look at her because she's from Colombia, American born. Her parents came over from Colombia. And so they're going back and forth. And you know, we had come up with a little signal because she was overprotective with me because I didn't speak the language. And so I just stood there and just, we walk off. They go, "Pat, the meeting would have contained somebody from a cartel." Oh, good to know. Not going.
Yeah.
Good to know. Don't want to see their face. Don't want to know anything about them.
Yeah.
I'm a dumb American. I'm ready to go home. But we did not have those situations the first 2 times, but this third time was a joke. And we had to delist the cartel and certain people in Colombia because we could not work with them because it was drug money.
Yeah.
And that's where I drew the line. And Giselle looked at me. She said, "Every dollar in America has been funneled through and laundered from drug money." I said, "Well, I don't want it coming at me directly, so I'm really easy to put a line in the sand here."
Yep. I see you, Illini.
Hey, Colonel.
Hey.
Good to see you. Happy Friday.
Happy Friday.
You know, you were mentioning the Cali cartel earlier. There was a movie that came out on Netflix a couple years ago called Operation Odessa, which, you know, has this interesting Russian military and Cali cartel tie-in where they wound up trying to buy a whole bunch of helicopters and even a submarine from the Russian military right after the Soviet Union collapsed. And it was all going to the folks in the Cali cartel. And now it's kind of interesting that there's this ultimately CIA tie-in to all of that. They eventually got, I think the Cali cartel eventually got busted. They got taken down by the U.S. government and the Colombians by the mid-90s, I want to say. But it's kind of interesting to follow all of the interesting politics around that.
Yeah, a lot of very interesting politics around that. And from my research, the only reason that any cartel, like the Medellin cartel, gets busted is because they go rogue. I mean, that's what happened to Noriega, too.
There you go. Yeah, they were worried that this is, I mean, some of the cartel members, some of the lower ranking capos were kind of worried about, like, this is going to bring a lot of heat. And the first thing that happened, of course, was that the Russian helicopters got photographed by the media at the airport and wound up in the international news.
Well,
that may have been the beginning of the end.
And what's really interesting about, and I don't know whether the movie was trying to depict something that they said was true or not. I'm not familiar with the movie, but a lot of the former Soviet Union material that was trafficked out of the Soviet Union all went through Bulgaria. And there's a very interesting that the that connection is rarely ever identified in news that's produced in the United States. It is always, if you read European news, with any of this stuff. They pinpoint Bulgaria repeatedly. In America, because we want to attribute everything bad to the Soviet Union and now Russia, you don't understand here, because of the way the news is crafted as opposed to reported, you don't understand that Bulgaria was the pivot point, and the CIA was intimately involved in the arms trafficking in Bulgaria. And so a lot of those stories, and I've read articles by of the same events that like shows up in Washington Post or the New York Times describing the exact same event. And then you go find an article that was written either in Italy or Germany, and you translate that, and you find out the word Bulgaria is in there multiple times, but not here. I find that extremely interesting because, again, one of the kind of patterns, if I see the word Bulgaria in any of the research that I do, I know immediately that it's an illicit arms deal. It is being done with some type of drug covert funding, as opposed to a legitimate state to state manifest the way arms are supposed to be transferred.
I guess I've got a couple other tie-ins for you that
Okay.
go back to the Paul Williams book. One of Paul Williams's big sources on Latin America, as well as on Vatican Bank, is Penny Lernoux, who was a
Yes.
big, liberal libertarian Catholic author from the 1980s, and she wrote two good books. First is Cry of the People, where she kind of documents the liberation theology movement through Latin America, but she also talks a lot about all of the fascist regimes and the dictatorships in Latin America
Yep.
in the 70s and 80s. And if you go through her book, you run into cocaine a number of times, including with the Argentina regime, but in particular with the Stroessner regime.
Yep.
Of Paraguay.
Yep.
And she details how it's this fascist regime with secret police doing torture, and oh, by the way, the secret police are all involved in cocaine trafficking.
Yep.
So you do have this continuity. She wrote the book in '82. And she also mentions, of course, the mafia links to cocaine in Honduras with their fascist regime. But you kind of see, there were contemporaneous books talking back then about U.S. government and CIA links to these regimes, and then of course their participation in drug trafficking.
And Paraguay is the place where, I don't remember, I think the number 400,000 hectare, how'd you say that, Bridget? Hectares. Farm that was purchased by Reverend Moon's Unification Church, that was co-located with the Paraguay ranch that was bought by the Bush family. But the one that the Unification Church bought had all kinds of clandestine airstrips, and we find the Unification Church was Reverend Moon specifically. We found him in the Say-Behind units in Korea. We found him in the World Anti-Communist League. We found him. He's the guy that owned the Washington Times, the newspaper. He actually owned the UP at one point before it went defunct. So yeah, there's tie-ins everywhere to this.
Yeah, it just seems to be sort of this continuous pattern. And I mean, I can usually draw sometimes if you're really lucky, there's a crimson thread between, the exact individual, but there's definitely crimson threads between the same organizations, same groups of people, same governments. And yeah, there's probably a lot more work to be done here connecting all these dots.
There's a reason why the CIA always installs a fascist dictatorship in the aftermath of one of their coups, right? Is that not a pattern?
It definitely seems like we always wind up getting some kind of right-wing dictator, and then the police are a little bit repressive, and oh, by the way, you find out that they're corrupt, and they're usually the ones who are participating in the problem that they're investigating.
A little bit corrupt. I'm thinking death squads is pretty damn corrupt, because every one of them ended up with an Office of Public Safety detachment in order to teach them how to disappear people under the guise of democracy. So if you're looking for a pattern, the pattern is that anytime the CIA destabilizes a government, it's probably a good government. Whether it's a great government, you can argue that point all day long. But it is a government that is not approved by the United States. And under the guise of quote unquote democracy, we end up with a fascist dictatorship. I've not found an exception to that rule, by the way.
Here's a great quote. Mussolini: "It's better to live one day as a lion than 100 years as a sheep." Yeah. But yeah, because I kept thinking, oh, the CIA is going to put good leadership in. Then I look at the leadership and I go, this is worse.
Every single time.
They can control them, they think? Is that the point? They can control them?
Yes. They owe their dictatorship to the people that put them in power. And as soon as the person that look at Saddam Hussein, the coup that put Saddam Hussein in power is and the same thing with the Shah. If you become so bad that they know they're not going to be able to control the sheep in the country, that they're going to rise up, they'll just overthrow the government that they installed and start anew. But there's never an exception to the fact that they put in an oppressive dictatorship, and that dictatorship invites in all of the enablers of this fascist dictatorship, like the U.S. oligarchs, the Office of Public Safety, the Office of Transition Initiatives, and every other USAID, National Endowment for Democracy, and more recently, the open society piece of it. That's how they stay in power. They can't stay in power because the majority of the people will rise up against them. So they have to implement an oppressive dictatorship in order to control the people, and they do it by terror. Bridget, go ahead.
The other day we had a discussion, and I want to share that here because it will help people with the why of the who, okay? You and I were talking, and I was explaining that I had gone to work for a rather, we'll say, an evil, patterned business. And he said everyone else that was at the business was either a drunk, they were addicted to drugs, they were cheating on their wives, cheating on their spouse, sleeping with someone else at the company, et cetera, et cetera. And periodically, the company would come through, and they would fire people like myself. Now, in my case, I didn't go to the bars, I didn't run with the crowds, I wasn't sleeping with anybody, I wasn't addicted to any drugs, I didn't have anything bad. He said, I didn't understand why they would do that. And you said something very profound, and it reminded me of these Gladio situations. And you said, because they could not control you. They didn't have any pressure point that they could use to manipulate you. And that is the way that they work within these groups. It's not a coincidence that they're all pedophiles. It's not a coincidence that Zelensky has a drug habit. It's not a coincidence that Joe Biden had openly incestuous relationship with his daughter. Those are the people that they can control. And it's also not a coincidence that the one that they hate, they investigated probably more than any of us could have been investigated and found nothing that they could use to control him. And that's the reason why they hate him. The deep state is specifically out there looking for, so as soon as you see these people pop up with these multiple skeletons in their closets, it's not a coincidence.
True.
There's a reason they chose them.
True.
Because they can put pressure on them.
So I want to call out Mother Goose over in Rumble. She was commenting on the William Ramsey interview that I did, and commenting on how well informed he was. And I did tell him after after we went off camera that it was a very interesting conversation with him, because he is so well informed. I really, really enjoyed that conversation, because it was more of a conversation as opposed to me presenting information. And you're right, Mother Goose, he is very informed. I loved that interview. So thank you for bringing that up. Southern, go ahead.
Well, people always complain about Trump, but Trump said something very significant about Iran. He goes, no, we're not going to determine who's going to lead the country. And that's very much against the CIA. They hate him. They hate him. But what is so apparent, what it takes to manage all this horrific behavior globally, and it's done to people's weaknesses: human trafficking, drugs, arms, etc. So it's playing to the worst of human nature. And I don't know, and this is just where I go, because this is kind of where I play in my head, is how are we going to change that? How is that going to have a slow death? Is that even a possibility that we can get out of this vicious cycle? And at the same time, we're finding out it's driving economies, keeping economies propped up. It's horrible.
Well,
it's a horrible thing.
I think absolutely there's a way out of it, or Trump wouldn't be trying to get us out of it. So I think the way ahead is supporting him and his efforts. As I was saying several, I don't know, it's probably a couple months, I lose track of time, that I think he already has mapped out how to do it. And I think that he knows what has to be the state of affairs at the end of this term. And I think in order to make that happen, he knows what has to be done by year 3 and by year 2 and by year 1. And we are watching that unfold, because as you pull on the thread, as we are seeing being pulled right now, and since January 20th, that operation is ongoing. And so I'm here for it. That's all I can say. And I do think that there is a way to do it, and I think they have figured out the best way to do that, and they're implementing it.
Yeah, it just boggles my mind, because Trump spent the 4 years between when he was elected, lost the election. I think he spent that 4 years putting this plan together.
Oh, I think he had the plan a long time ago.
Well, I do know that he understood USAID, because he tried to take away their funding. He was able to pull out 37%. But what we learned under Biden, that money just moved around, where money was coming from EPA.
But Southern
boxes. So they're money laundering inside of the government, basically.
But Southern,
yeah,
they could track it then, because as you guys know, um, there are mechanisms that by doing that during his first term, it did make them scramble. And there's enough people inside that were able to watch what was done. And that's the reason why on January 20th, he could hit the ground running. He basically started the ripple in his first 4 years of getting them to self identify who they were and began to monitor those people in order to, because don't forget, as Brian Cates always points out, they had a secret, um, what's the word, where they were gathering, huh? No, they had a not an indictment, but a basically a secret authorization that I think the number was like 86 congressional members had their, and the only two people that came out and said that it had happened was Adam Schiff and Eric Swalwell, where they were notified after they were done gathering the information that Verizon had, or Apple, sorry, had a secret gag order that they could not disclose, that they were under court order to basically provide all of the private information off of their communication devices. That went on for 3 years. And the only way we know it went on is because after it stopped, Apple then has a requirement to let people know. And the two people that came out and said, oh my God, I was being spied on, was Adam Schiff and Eric Swalwell. But there were over 80 of them, it was disclosed, that's why I'm saying there's so much to this that I feel very comfortable watching this unfold, because I do believe Trump has everything he needs to bring them down. But the collapse is going to be a planned collapse so our country doesn't collapse.
Yeah. But I can see where Trump is doing that here in the U.S. and anybody that works with us. But the other countries are still going to be playing with drugs, arms, and human trafficking. I don't know how we're going to get there, because human trafficking, especially children, is what breaks me down, takes me down. And two of my good friends are ex-NSA, and they were involved with human trafficking, and it has really messed with them.
But understand that Trump went around the world and got people to work with him during his first term. This is not just Trump doing this. This is a global effort. And there are ways in order to cut them off. And I do believe we're going to see that happen. Illini, go ahead.
Hey, Colonel, I was wondering if you ran into the comments that Patrick Byrne made this week. He was getting interviewed by News Nation, where he started talking about how he was in a meeting in a safe house somewhere in Europe. This is while Biden is president, and he's there with General Flynn, and they're talking to these Serbian programmers who were working for Smartmatic, who he claims were describing to him, how they were rigging the election in 2020 and how they've been doing it for 20 years. I guess for background on this, Patrick Byrne lost his job as the CEO of Overstock shortly after he alleged that the FBI had kind of cornered him and asked him to help frame Hillary Clinton, and they were going to basically run this operation, and Obama was going to use it to control her. And then, of course, he got into trouble in 2020 for flying protesters off to Washington, D.C. But I'm wondering, this seems like another pretty wild story. That number one, there's some other, entity or organization or source of power trying to stop the Biden administration, that and they're meeting at the safe house in Europe during his term. How do you assess all of
Uh, I don't know. I it's almost, I get the feeling that there's almost this psychological operation, slow release of information that is occurring to seed narratives that are in fact true in a way that prepares for something that's about to drop. And I've watched this play out on multiple fronts. I don't tend to, I did uh, see that interview and what he was saying, but I don't tend to comment on that because there's no way to verify it. Um, but what I have noticed is a trend, a pattern, that these things come out and then in short order, there's more information that comes out about it from someone else. And it's almost in a good way like seeding a narrative to then have some big exposure of, and now because the information was already out there in little snippets, it's a lot easier for most people to digest the information, because then people, and it's exactly like kind of what they were doing in reverse, like for people who were exposing information, and you get the immediate, oh, that's been debunked, and the immediate attack on information. And because the New York Times and the Washington Post and all those other people, they would put little things out in snippets and then be able to come back immediately and go, oh, no, that's been debunked and all of that other stuff. Where now we're seeing it almost play out the exact opposite, where this little bits of information come out from some of the key players, in the MAGA movement, that are credible, and it seems to kind of, and we've heard about this Serbia narrative for several years now, but it's kind of worked its way up the chain to now Patrick Burns, and I do anticipate that within short order we're going to see someone else divulge a little bit more about it, and then all of a sudden you're going to have like some big action on it. And I just see that as a pattern, being played out. But like I said, I don't like going into those types of things because I don't have anything to work with. And I do think that from my position, if I start wandering off in these areas where I'm not, um, you know, like you're always reeling me back in on, yes, we have verification of this, we have verification of that. I tend to like to stay in my lane, of the stuff that I know, and I can prove, and I don't have any ability to do any of that in those areas, but I am very, uh, conscious of how those types of things play over into our specialty here, and it makes perfect sense to me.
I guess the most shocking part of all of this is that Patrick Byrne was he was under investigation by the FBI for, January 6th, was able to make it out of the country into Europe to this safe house and have this conversation alongside General Flynn. At least that is his claim.
Right.
And at this point, nothing would shock me. And we may find out that, there were certain things going on inside the BIOS of the administrative state to fight the whole corruption going on, and that may have been part of all of this. It'll be very interesting to see how things shake out, and what will be really interesting is if some independent researcher out there can prove that Patrick Byrne was in Europe.
Right.
That'll be really interesting.
I agree. And I don't have any of those skills. Go ahead, Stellar. What are you up to?
Oh, not much. As we're talking about all this stuff that's happening, for me, I'm just like tickled pink. Seeing the corporation, aka Las Vegas corporations, all think because they can't hide. I mean, there's no money coming through, so they can't even hide behind any of that stuff anymore. There's no people coming in here to hide behind all of that. So, how I've been watching that for over a year now. So it's literally starting to trickle. So it's kind of good seeing a lot of this stuff getting cleaned out. So yeah, I hope that, like with Patrick Byrne, I'd heard his story for a while too. And so I just been wondering, like, has anyone ever been able to confirm it and stuff? And then in my mind, McAfee pops in my head as well. But, we don't know about that because he supposedly gave computers that were set up also to the Obama administration too. So who knows? We'll see what happens.
Yeah, the whole McAfee thing, and then who has that information. Um, Very, very interesting because, even if he's actually dead, that the information is not dead. Um, yeah, it's all very interesting. Lots of little loose ends out there.
Yeah, and I'm one of those conspiracy people. I don't think he is dead, so I think a lot of this stuff is, I don't know. I just think for a very long time that there were the right people that were in place, and I do feel that a lot of this stuff right now we're hearing about it, and things are getting dismantled. In my personal opinion, but I think it's been an ongoing operation for decades.
It's definitely been going on for a while. All right. I don't see any more hands. I'm going to jump off here and go grab something to eat. And I appreciate everybody being here today. Like I said, next week's going to be kind of a hit or miss kind of schedule, but I will try to do them early in the morning, like around 8 o'clock. And that way we can go out and enjoy the company with my girlfriend, and but still be able to get this information out because, like I told you guys, I just found this book completely fascinating because it broke so many um, preconceptions that I had, and I was never assigned to Southcom, but because they were right down the street from CENTCOM, I mean, we were in Tampa, they were in Miami. There was a lot of interaction, and I did have a very good friend of mine whose husband spent 3 years in the intelligence area of Southcom. So I know quite a bit about what their mission was. And I would love, they're divorced now, so I don't have any contact with him, but I would love to be able to talk to him about some of this information and how it sits with the information that they were dealing with out at Southcom, as opposed to being out in the field. Although I know he traveled down there routinely as well. So, anyway, okay, you guys have a nice weekend, and I will talk with you soon. Take care.
Have an amazing weekend.
Thanks. You too. See you.